It's a great pleasure to come again to this grand institution, where, as Professor Stein mentioned, I have been before. We are indeed long-standing friends and colleagues, but I think it's more than that when I speak about Ken as a scholar, really a leading scholar of Middle Eastern studies in the social history of Palestine, in more modern peacemaking diplomacy. But I would also like to to congratulate Ken for the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the Center for Israel Studies here at Emory, which is a phenomenal achievement and a great service to the university and to the community of Atlanta. But another thing I would like to say about Ken that I don't find too many people that one comes in contact with, whether it is in academia or other facets of life. Ken has remarkable, not only scholarly achievement, but civic courage to stand up publicly to people in power and speak the truth in the name of what he believes is right. And for that, and everything else he has done, I salute him. Now to the mundane business of the Middle East. This is a region of great crisis, needless to say. But especially in the last few decades, what one could call the crisis of the Arabs. Today, if you listen to the news about the Middle East, or you look at what's happening in the Middle East, you will hear much about three Middle Eastern countries: Iran, Turkey, and Israel, none of which is an Arab state. The Arab states have lost a great deal of the regional influence they once had. Countries like Egypt or Syria, Iraq, commanded a great deal of influence in the region and internationally as well. This is no longer the case. They are not the movers and shakers of what takes place in the Middle East. So why is that so? Why is that so, and what are the consequences? And what does it mean for the region? What does it mean for Israel's place in the region? That is what I wish to address. Over the last 2 decades, more or less, the United Nations has published a series almost annually on the Arab world. These publications are called the Arab Human Development Reports. And I strongly suggest to anyone who has an interest in Middle Eastern affairs to read these reports. You don't have to read the whole report, it's hundreds of pages, but they have an executive summary at the beginning, 10 or 15 pages or so. And what is interesting about these reports, they come from a respectable institution, the United Nations. The reports are written in the main by Arab scholars, sociologists, economists, political scientists, etc. That is, it is not written by foreigners about the Arabs. It is a composition written mainly by Arabs about the Arabs. And therefore, I think it has a special measure of credibility, because one cannot say, oh, these are a bunch of Americans or Europeans who are biased against people from the Middle East or something of that nature. And as I say, these reports have been coming out for the last almost 20 years, and they are very pessimistic documents. If you read these reports, written 10 or 15 years ago, you will understand very easily why the Middle East today looks the way it does. There is a lot of foresight. in these reports. And they spoke about the Arab world that has three major deficits. A deficit in political freedom, a deficit in first world education systems, and a deficit in gender equality. These are the three main deficits. The first two, the deficit in political freedom and the deficit in first world education systems, lead to the creation of economies that have very low levels of innovation. Countries that do not have political freedom do not really encourage creative thinking and innovation. And countries that don't have first world education systems do not produce the people who will create the innovation and the high tech that runs the economies of the world today. And as a result, these economies in the Arab world are very far behind. To these two factors comes the third, the lack of gender equality. Now one may say, all this talk about gender equality is just another round of political correctness because it's the right thing to do to talk about gender equality. This is not about political correctness. This is about economics. If you do not have gender equality, and women are not as well educated as men, there is a very strong tendency of women not to be integrated into the workforce. This is also a result of tradition, where it is in many Arab countries unacceptable for women to work outside the home for reasons of female modesty. The result of this is poorly performing economies which have very low levels of female participation. Almost half the population doesn't work, and so already you have a major shortage of human resources. And women who have lower levels of education also tend to have larger families. That's not a Middle Eastern phenomenon, that's universal. So you have this combination of poorly performing economies and rapidly growing populations. Well, you don't have to be an economist to realize that this is a formula for catastrophe. Now, this is not a prediction. This is the catastrophe. We're in it. That's what it looks like. So this is not a prediction about what is going to happen. This is an analysis of what has already happened. What is the way out? The population of the Middle East, of the Arab Middle East, in the year 2000 was 280 million. The population of the Arab countries today is 380 million. In the 2020s, it's going to be 460 million. Who's going to provide for these people? Who's going to provide jobs for these people? Who's going to provide water for these people? Food and sustenance. They're going to have to emigrate in large numbers, which they are already doing. You can see the massive emigration from the Arab countries to Europe, and many connected this with the Syrian civil war. In part, that's true. But the Syrian civil war may end very shortly. But many people from the Arab Middle East will have to continue to emigrate. Because the Middle East cannot sustain its population. So you have the huge generation of people like you. People between the ages of 18 and 30, who an American historian has called the waithood generation. Why the waithood generation? You go from boyhood, from childhood to boyhood, and from boyhood to waithood. This age from 18 to 30, where you wait for a decent education, for a job. And they all know, this whole generation of people from 18 to 30, that neither the decent education nor the job are coming. It's an atmosphere of profound hopelessness. What is our future? What is the future of our children? People in this age group are finding it increasingly difficult to get married because they don't have the wherewithal to manage a household and a family. So they just do not have the very basics of the kind of life that you have. And from the internet, they know exactly what kind of life everybody else has. They know exactly what they don't have in comparison to the rest of humanity. So a few years ago, 2011, a few years beyond that, there was this huge revolutionary trend in the Arab world that was called the Arab Spring. The belief, using this term Arab Spring, as you know from your history classes, I'm sure, in 1848, in Europe there was what they called the Spring of Nations. And in 1968 there was the Prague Spring when the Czechs rose against the Soviets. These springs in Europe were liberal democratic movements of people seeking a greater measure of freedom. So by calling this the Arab Spring, which was a Western term, the term Arab Spring was invented in Washington. It's not what the Arabs spoke about. The Arabs called it Thawra, which is revolution. It's now translated from the English into Arabic. Now the Arabs also say Al-Rabi' al-Arabi, which is the Arab Spring, but they're translating from English now. This was not a movement for liberal democracy. This was a movement for people who didn't have a life, for an opportunity, for an economic opportunity more than anything else, to try and bring about change. And all they could say in terms of bringing about change was that the ruler, whether it be Mubarak or others in the region, in Egypt, Mubarak, they must go. He in power must leave. But beyond that, there was no program. And in some cases, they were successful. Mubarak was actually overthrown. But now in Egypt, you have another autocracy that has replaced the previous autocracy. It's not liberal democracy that followed, but other forms of autocracy and political oppression. So the Arab Spring, actually, was not this great movement of liberal democratization, but this great movement of people in distress, people facing economic disaster, and what could possibly be done about it. So this is all a representation of Arab disarray, failure to modernize successfully. You look around other countries in the Middle East, like Iran and Turkey, that are now filling in the void of Arab failure. And you may ask, why is it that the Turks and the Iranians were more successful than the Arabs were? How come their countries are not doing fantastically well, but doing a lot better than the Arab countries? I think the main answer to that is that both the Turks and the Persians are not new countries. They've been around for centuries. Long-standing nations that have a very long tradition of sovereignty, of government, even of empire. You can say that of both the Turks and the Persians, which cannot be said of the great majority of the Arab states. A sign of this weakness, of this almost absence, you could say, look at the crisis in Syria. Syria had this long civil war that went on for years. They are now organizing a settlement in Syria. So who's organizing the settlement in Syria? Russia, Turkey, and Iran. The Arabs aren't even at the table. They weren't even invited. So this long decline, one could say, didn't begin with the Arab Spring. It goes back for half a century, more or less, this gradual dissipation of Arab cohesion and power. In 1958, Egypt united with Syria in what became the United Arab Republic, which was a great achievement of Arab unity and Arab nationalism. Well, the union between Syria and Egypt fell apart 3 years later in 1961. In 1962, Egypt got sucked into its own Vietnam, a civil war in Yemen, and Arabism and Arab nationalism was going into greater and greater distress. But then came the major catastrophic defeat, the defeat to Israel in 1967. That war, which Israelis call the Six-Day War because it ended in 6 days, the term itself is humiliating. The Arabs don't like calling it the Six-Day War, they don't. They call it the 67 War or the June War. But the war in 1967 was the exposure of the weakness of the movement to Arab nationalism and Arab unity. The idea that the unification of the Arabs, led by Egypt of Abdel Nasser, and Abdel Nasser was such a great leader on the international scene that this movement for Arab unity was called Nasserism. It was named after him. That this union of the Arabs would lead to their prestige, to their prosperity, and to their power. And there was a formula. Arab socialism, Arab unity, and alliance with the Soviet Union. In 1967, all this came to naught. In 6 days of war, it wasn't just the defeat in the battlefield. It was the defeat of the whole idea. That this idea of Arab unity and Arab nationalism was the avenue to Arab redemption. In 1967, it proved to be an empty vessel. But what is this meaning of the failure of Pan-Arabs? Arabism and Arab nationalism is a secular idea, not religious. To be an Arab is based on your language, like to be a German. And the idea of Arab nationalism is taken from the European example. Germans speak German and they have a country called Germany. And the French people speak French and they have a country called France. So the argument went, so we who speak Arabic are a nation, the Arab nation. Not Muslims or Christians. This was a way of evading and avoiding the sectarian definition based on religion, which is the way people in the Middle East defined themselves for centuries. The idea that people were a people because of the language they spoke is a European import. That was not the way people in the Middle East defined themselves. So the collapse of Arab nationalism is the collapse of secular politics. It's the collapse of this platform of secularizing politics. So what comes instead of that? It's back to religion. The rise of political Islam. On the ruins of Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism was supposed to unite all the Arabs on the basis of the language they speak. That is, to override the idea of sectarian definition. It didn't matter, in theory at least, if you were Muslim or Christian or Alawi or Druze or whatever sect you may be. If you spoke Arabic, you were an Arab. Arabism therefore papered over the sectarian divisions. But political Islam exacerbates the sectarian divisions. If we're talking about political Islam, then what kind of Muslim are you? Are you Sunni or are you Shiite? And if you're not a Muslim, then what kind of Christian are you? Are you Maronite Catholic? Or do you belong to an Eastern church? Are you Orthodox, Greek Orthodox? Or Greek Catholic? Or Copt? Or Armenian? Political Islam is destructively divisive. So you have this divide between Sunnis and Shiites. Iraq, for example, is a country whose unity in the name of Arabism, as the British created Iraq, no longer exists. Because the Sunnis and the Shiites are not on the same page. In this competition now between Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims, the Sunnis are at a disadvantage. And the Shiites have an advantage. Iran is a Shiite Muslim state. So if Shiite Muslims have the advantage, this is an advantage for Iran over the Arabs. And one of the explanations, amongst a few others, why in this struggle for supremacy between Sunnis and Shiites, the Shiites seem to have turned the historical turn of events about face. The Shi'is were always the downtrodden underclass of the Muslim world. That is no longer true. So why do the Shiites have an advantage? One of them has to do with political doctrine. Radicalism, Islamic radicalism, Sunni style, is not the same as Islamic radicalism, Shiite style. The Sunnis believe in the inherent supremacy of Islamic law. That is, society can only be just if it is conducted according to Islamic law. The implementation of Islamic law, the Sharia. That is the main Sunni principle. The main Shiite principle doesn't emphasize the law, but the nature of the ruler of the jurisprudence, the ruler of the man of religion, the ruler of the cleric. In Sunnah, there is no papacy. There is no central authority in the Sunni world. So there are hundreds of interpretations of how you're supposed to go about the implementation of religious law. And the Sunni world is like the Hobbesian world of war of all against all. Hundreds of interpretations, hundreds of schools, hundreds of militias, all against each other on the manner in which this Sunni Islamic program ought to be implemented. But in the Shiite world, the rule of the cleric is really there. They sit in Tehran. And the cleric who rules in Tehran has the ear and the support of the great majority of Shiites throughout the region. So the Shiite camp is very cohesive, propelled and guided by the rule in power in Tehran, by the Ayatollahs. And the Sunnis are completely in total disarray. So Iran, even in the field of dogma, has this strategic advantage. If you add to that the consequences of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, you have another major contribution, not to what the Americans wanted, but to what they achieved. The rising power of Iran versus the Sunnis and the Arabs. Here is Iran, and here is Iraq. Iraq is the gatekeeper of the Arab East. Saddam Hussein may have been a really nasty guy, and he was. But if you overthrow Saddam Hussein and his regime, which was dominated by the Sunnis, you are handing Iraq over to the Shiites, who happen to be the majority of the population in Iraq, who were always suppressed by the Sunni minority. So it may be democratically correct to have the Shiite majority in power in Iraq. But if the Shiite majority is in power in Iraq, then Iraq becomes a province of Iranian influence. And the gatekeeper of the Arab East is gone. And Iran becomes this country that has strategic influence throughout the entire Fertile Crescent, which is this entire area all the way to the Mediterranean. They have allies in Syria. There are Shiites in Lebanon. The most powerful minority in Lebanon today are the Shiites. who have this militia called Hezbollah, and these are the people that work at the behest of Iran, like proxies. So in this new regional setup, where is Israel? How does Israel fit into this new order? First of all, Israel used to be alone against everybody. No longer. If the Shiites, run by Iran, and the Sunni Arabs are contesting with each other, and Israel is a major power in the region with whom Iran is hostile, then Israel and the Arab Sunnis have common cause versus Iran. Israel today has Arab allies all over the place. Never used to be like that. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, other countries in the Gulf, all look to Israel as a potential supporter in the confrontation with Iran. For decades, the Middle East was defined by the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict essentially is over. We still have the issue of Palestine and the Palestinians, and I will come back to that a little later. But the old Arab-Israeli conflict, the conflict between Israel and the Arab states, is over. Once Egypt, realizing that it didn't have the power to wage the war against Israel anymore, in the 1970s, going back now to Jimmy Carter, Egypt made its peace with Israel. Once Egypt made its peace with Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict was essentially over. The Arab states cannot go to war with Israel without Egypt. It's impossible. They are not strong enough to face Israel without Egypt as the leading major political and military force. So even though other Arab states like Syria did not make their peace with Israel, they couldn't make war with Israel either. So essentially, the Arab-Israeli conflict is over. Israel now faces not the Arab states, but Iran. And the question is, how exactly should this be pursued? And here I would say one can think about US and Israeli strategy as it is presently, that is to pressure the Iranian regime and maybe to lead to its overthrow. Another alternative strategy would perhaps be to seek avenues of negotiation maybe with Iran. And the question here is, what drives the Iranians? What motivates them to behave the way they do? And there are two possible analyses here. One is that Iran is fundamentally aggressive, expansionist, and therefore has to be fought against, and there's no room for discussion or negotiation. The other possibility is that Iran is driven by a sense of self-defense. Iran is a country that for more than a century has suffered from internal interference in its affairs. Threats coming from the United States or Israel that the regime ought to be overthrown only reinforces these fears in Iran that others like the US and Israel are out to get them. And if the Iranians feel that the US and Israel are out to get them, surely they'll pursue influence in countries like Syria and Lebanon to put the pressure on Israel. So maybe, instead of this policy of outright confrontation, maybe there should also be thought about not abandoning the forceful attitude, but to, along with a big stick, to also think about some avenues of negotiation. Maybe they would work, they're at least worth a try. Even if it fails, there's nothing to lose by it. What about Russia? The Russians are the people who turned the tables in the confrontation in Syria. It's the Russians who paved the way for the victory of the Syrian regime. Why did the Russians interfere? This again comes back in part to the role of the United States in American policy. Russian interference in Syria was possible because of a very passive attitude taken by the US administration. And here I must say, I don't want to tread on anybody's sore feet. I don't want to get into American affairs about which I don't know that much. Obama and Trump were just the same. Equally inactive. Trump may speak differently or tweet differently, but in action, no difference. Just the same. The low American footprint, the diminishing footprint in Syria and elsewhere, therefore paving the way for very easy Russian intervention, motivated by, I would say, three factors. One, the drive of Russia under Putin to re-establish itself as a great power. Secondly, partly connected to the first, the need that the Russians have for bases that are in Syria, air and naval bases. And in cooperation with the present regime, they have these bases, which are very important for their presence in the Middle East. And thirdly, the Russians could not tolerate the rise of powers like ISIS in Syria. For the Russians, ISIS had to lose. Russia has no interest in Sunni Muslim radicals. They have enough of their own in Russia. The Chechens in Russia. There are more than 1 million Chechens who live in Moscow. The Russians are desperately afraid of the rise of Sunni radicalism in the Middle East region, and therefore had a vested interest in the victory of the Syrian regime against these Islamist opponents. So that is the lay of the land in the regional architecture and the influence of the great powers. So what about the Palestinian issue? Some would say the Arabs don't care. The world doesn't seem to care very much about the Palestinian issue. So why should Israel bother? I think it is incumbent upon Israel to bother a great deal about the Palestinian issue. Whether the world and the Arabs care about it or not does not matter. Israel must care about the Palestinian issue because the Palestinian issue sits on Israel's doorstep. And Israel cannot ignore the fact that as we look at little Israel with the West Bank and Gaza together, historical British mandatory Palestine, the Jewish and Arab populations are more or less equal. 6 million each. There are huge difficulties in arriving at a peaceful settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. And I will just briefly dwell on why it is that Israel has made peace with Arab states like Egypt and Jordan, was nearly there with Syria in the 1990s, and yet with the Palestinians, nothing seems to work. President Trump has in his pocket the deal of the century. Yeah, I have my doubts. Not about his pocket, but about the deal. Why is it so difficult? Why doesn't it work ever? The Oslo Accords were signed 25 years ago and never really got very far. The difference is in the major difference between Israel-Palestine and Israel and the Arab states. There were two great wars between Israel and the Arabs. The 1948 war, what Israel calls its War of Independence, and what for the Palestinians was the great historical defeat of 1948. and the War of 1967, when Israel occupied territories of the neighboring Arab countries. So you have what I call two files, the 1967 file and the 1948 file. The issues that are a consequence of the War of 1967 and the issues that are a consequence of the War of 1948. With Egypt and Syria, we only have 1967 issues. We conquered their territory in the war in 1967. We can give them back the territory we conquered in 1967 and make peace. Between Israel and Palestine, there are two sets of issues. The 1967 issues, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, but there are also the 1948 issues. The issue of Palestinian refugee return to Israel, for example. That is, in the negotiations with the Palestinians, if you want to end the conflict, it's not enough for Israel to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza. Israel also has to open the question of Israel's foundation itself. And Israel won't do that. Israel will not agree to the return of millions of Palestinian refugees to Israel and endanger the very nature of the state of the Jewish people. And the Palestinians find giving up the idea of refugee return in 1948, giving up the very core of their collective belief. After all, what makes Palestinians Palestinian? They're Sunni Muslims and they speak Arabic just like their neighbors. But what makes Palestinians Palestinian is 1948. The defeat of 1948. The sense of association with that historical, traumatic event that is the backbone of Palestinian identity. So they cannot concede on 1948. And Israel cannot concede on 1948 either. So you may talk about the West Bank and Gaza and come to all sorts of understandings, maybe on that. That in itself is difficult, but let's say that, relatively speaking, is the easy stuff. And the negotiators constantly come up against this wall of the 1948 questions. And the negotiations essentially fail. So what can be done? Should it just be left like this? Should Israel remain in constant conflict and occupation with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? Israel faces a great dilemma. And the great dilemma is this. It's true we cannot negotiate an agreement with the Palestinians at present. But we cannot continue the status quo either. You cannot just leave things as they are. Even if a negotiated agreement is not possible, you cannot just leave things as they are. Israel, from its foundation, sought to be two things. One was to be the nation state of the Jewish people. That place where the Jewish people had a long-standing permanent majority that would ensure the right of the Jewish people to self-determination like all nations. And Israel also sought to be a legitimate member of the family of nations. And if you read Israel's Declaration of Independence, it's very clear, both of these ideas. To be the nation state of the Jewish people and to be a legitimate member of the family of nations. If Israel continues the occupation of the West Bank, it will gradually lose its Jewish majority. And it will soon cease to be a legitimate member of the family of nations. It will not be able to maintain its two cardinal beliefs over an extended period of time if things do not change. So what does Israel do? Negotiations with the Palestinians continue to fail. They are not a very promising avenue to pursue. Yet Israel cannot allow the present situation to continue to fester. The option that Israel has, that I would argue is probably the only avenue to pursue at present, is for Israel to unilaterally launch an initiative of its own, irrespective of agreement with the Palestinians or not, to allow for the gradual emergence of a Palestinian state next door. It may not be peace in our time, it probably won't be, but it will allow Israel to remain the nation state of the Jewish people and the legitimate member of the family of nations. And lastly, we talk endlessly about the Middle East. But I would argue that the term Middle East the time has come to think of something else. The term Middle East doesn't really make that much sense anymore. It is of colonial origin. It was a name that was determined at first by an American naval historian, Admiral Mahan, who wrote an article in 1902 about the Middle East, and the term caught on. The Middle East makes no sense to the people who live in the region. If you live in Tel Aviv or in Istanbul or Tehran, you're not living in the middle or the east of anything. It's only the Middle East if you're looking at the region from Washington or from Paris. That part which is in the middle, on the way to the Far East. It's a colonial thing. It comes from colonial times. And it suited the colonial world because in this chunk called the Middle East, the Arab world, as the British like to call it, this was the passage to India. And the British were very interested in the Arab world and even in Arab nationalism, because the Arabs straddled the passage to India. So the Middle East and the Arab world means the Middle East became very common. But the passage to India is a movie now and doesn't make much strategic sense anymore. The Arab-Israeli conflict, which was the very core of the Arab world for decades, doesn't exist either. And the Middle East, therefore, I would argue, has lost its meaningful use as a coherent form of analysis. I would say the region is divided into 4 major subsections. North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Fertile Crescent, which is this part of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and then the Gulf, which some would call the Persian Gulf, and the Arabs, of course, would call it the Arab Gulf. So those are the 4 subsections of the region. Israel, for example, will probably not be part of the Middle East, but it is a part of the Eastern Mediterranean. And Israel is very much part of the Eastern Mediterranean, with Egypt, which is equally a part of the Eastern Mediterranean, and other countries like Greece and Cyprus, Bulgaria, and even Italy. So you can see ever more political and strategic interaction between Egypt and Israel, Greece and Cyprus, not Egypt with the Arabs necessarily speaking, Egypt more with the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean, and Israel too. Israel has a lot more in common with Greece and Cyprus than it will have with Iraq of the future or Syria of the future. So in that respect too, I would say it's a time to think again about where the Middle East is going. Thank you for your patience. I'll take your questions.
Is there a class that's coming in next? How much time?
5 minutes it starts.
So, we've got 5 minutes.
Okay, so who wants to ask a question? Or make a comment? Yes, yes.
So did you say that?
Speak up, please. Speak up.
So did you say that the way to maybe cause peace in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine would be to grant Palestine a place of their own, or what was that?
Eventually, yes, indeed. I think that is important, and I would say, in the way I think of this, in the Israeli national anthem, we speak about being a free people in our country. We say Am Chofshi Ba'artzenu. I don't think we really will be a free people in our country unless the Palestinians are a free people in theirs. As much as we deserve a right to self-determination, so do they. And if we cannot arrive at this through negotiation, then maybe we should try to arrive at it by Israel taking initiative of its own. Israel is in a relatively powerful position. Israel is, let's say, more secure now than it used to be. It's also economically quite powerful. I would say this is the time for the Israelis to think of taking actions that would allow for this reality to emerge, even though it is a very risky business. And it may not turn out. Israel withdrew from Gaza unilaterally, and the end result was not very good.
Yeah.
And missiles fly into Israel from Gaza every now and then. But if you ask almost any Israeli today, should we take Gaza? Most would say no. The reason why Israel withdrew from Gaza has to do with the distinction that we make in Israel between two types of security. Basic security and current security. Current security is the policing of Israel on a day-to-day basis, keeping the people safe. Basic security is about the long-term existence of Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Israel withdrew from Gaza not to stop the rockets. The people who decided to withdraw from Gaza didn't think for a moment that the rockets would stop. But there are 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, over whom the Israelis don't want to rule. So the decision there had to do with the maintaining of Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, not stopping the rockets. And I would argue that that kind of thinking is what should guide Israel in reference to the West Bank as well. Not that it's risk-free, but in any decision you make, whether it is your own personal life decisions or strategic decisions that states have to make, you always have to consider the alternative. If you make this decision, there are risks involved. But if you don't make it, you'll be worse off. So that is the calculation that I'm speaking about.
Take one more.
Yes, sir. You.
Oh, I was going to ask, as I'm Egyptian, I lived the Egyptian Revolution.
Yes.
Your comment earlier about autocracy and how it's going from one autocracy to another.
Yes.
Do you think the Arab people are ready for democracy? Because with all of these political factions that are splitting the regions and a lot of radical beliefs that are trying to go to the top?
I don't think. I think all people, and the Arab people also, are ready to democracy, ready for democracy, just as much as anybody else is. The problem here is not just whether the Arab people are ready for democracy. The problem is the powers that be in respective Arab societies, are they willing to give way in order to allow for democracy to emerge? And in Egypt, the Muslim Brethren were democratically elected and then overthrown by the military, strongly supported by a large segment of the Egyptian public who were afraid of what the Muslim Brethren were doing, that is, Islamizing the country too much and too fast as far as they were concerned. There hasn't been a very strong democratic tradition in the Arab world, that's true. But I think it's flawed to say that, you know, such and such a people can be Democrats and others can't be Democrats. I don't think that's so. All can be Democrats. And the Arabs and the Muslims as well. But that requires a greater emphasis, a much greater emphasis in the Arab world on individual rights, rather than group rights. Arab society is very much built on a composition of society made up of groups, not of individuals. People belong to groups. Their families, their extended families, their tribes, their sects. Group values override individual values, very often in the Arab domestic debate. That makes democracy a little bit more difficult. That would have to change. Take Iraq, for example. The American invasion of Iraq overthrew the autocratic regime, opened the way for people to organize as individuals in political parties and establish democracy. But they didn't organize as individuals in political parties. They organized according to their sects and went to civil war between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Because group identity is much stronger than individual rights. And that is a composition, I would say it's a factor within Arab politics. It's a factor within Arab society, and for them to overcome the, let's say, the authoritarian reality, it will require a change there. But there is also a sense in deep economic distress. In Egypt, for example, people were very supportive of the rise of the military to power again, because the military will keep order. And it won't turn into chaos. The fear of chaos is greater than the fear from autocracy. Rather have an autocrat like Sisi and the military in power than have chaos. Egypt has 97 million people. Egypt grows by 2 million people a year. In 2050, if the current population increase continues, there will be 151 million people in Egypt. That is unmanageable. There is a great fear of public order, and therefore a tendency towards autocracy which remains.
Asha, we have to end it there. We have
Yeah.
a class waiting. Thank you very much.